The Grand Orelia Hotel shimmered like a palace designed not just for comfort, but to remind anyone who entered that wealth was a language all its own. The chandeliers dripped with gold light. Polished marble floors reflected the heels and shoes of foreign guests who spoke in hushed tones and rolled their tongues in accents from every corner of the globe. Men with sleek briefcases and women adorned with diamonds passed through the lobby. As though they were part of a performance, each one rehearsed in the art of appearing important. The air carried the faint scent of lilies mixed with expensive cologne, and even the silence seemed orchestrated to impress. Michael Carter walked through the center of this theater of power like its undisputed king. Heads turned, whispers floated, though no one dared approach him directly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair combed back with precision. His light blue tailored suit cut to announce both wealth and authority. His eyes were the sharp blue of glass against ice, the kind that unsettled boardrooms and dismantled negotiations without the need for raised voices. He didn't have to speak loudly to be heard. Power radiated from his presence. To him, the world was a chessboard, each move calculated long before his opponent even knew the game had begun. Every contract, every handshake, every smile was a piece moved forward to checkmate. That morning, his steps carried him toward a private conference hall where European investors waited. Billions hung in the balance. But to Michael, it was simply another maneuver in an endless war for dominance. He gave curt nods to his aides and lawyers, his voice calm and clipped as he issued instructions. He had reviewed every clause of the contracts until they felt etched into him like scripture. Nothing would surprise him. Nothing would rattle him. Control was his armor, and he wore it without flaw. Not far away, unnoticed by the swirl of wealth and status, a little girl sat on a bench near the service corridor. Her name was Emily. She was 7, small for her age, with blonde hair tied back into a loose ponytail that sagged slightly to one side. Her white dress was creased, her denim jacket too large, sleeves dangling past her wrists. Her shoes were scuffed, the soles thinning at the edges, and in her lap rested a faded backpack whose zipper stuck halfway closed. She didn't belong in this hall of chandeliers and pearls, and yet she sat quietly, her legs swinging above the polished marble. As though trying to make herself as invisible as possible, Emily was used to being invisible. Her mother worked as a maid in the hotel, cleaning the very rooms where power whispered and money slept. While her mother disappeared into hours of labor, Emily learned to wait. She had become skilled at silence, at blending into corners, at being small enough that no one felt the need to move her along. But her wide blue eyes saw everything. She watched the parade of guests as if studying a play, each character with their rehearsed lines and carefully chosen costumes. She listened, to tones, to accents, to the rhythm of conversation she only half understood. In her stillness, she was a collector of secrets. That morning, as Michael Carter's empire prepared to expand in a room of gleaming wood and glass, Emily's curiosity tugged her feet away from the bench. She drifted toward the quieter side of the lobby, where the air lost some of its perfume and carried instead the smells of polish, soap, and freshly ironed linens. The service corridor beckoned her like a hidden door in a grand stage set, the place where the actors disappeared when the lights dimmed. Her sneakers squeaked softly as she slipped around the corner, unnoticed by the guests and ignored by the staff too busy carrying trays and betting Dottie was there. In the shadow of that ornate palace, that the worlds of Michael Carter and Emily began to inch closer. He, untouchable and armored in power, walked toward the meeting that would cement his empire. She, small and restless, drifted into the hidden veins of the hotel where whispers carried differently. Neither yet knew that their paths would collide, that a single fragile thread of fate had begun to tighten. Emily paused by a doorway, pressing her back to the wall. The light was dimmer here, the hum of voices lower, but clearer. She tilted her head and listened. 2 men in uniform stood close, their words foreign to most ears in the hotel, but not to Emily. She had been listening all her life, the sound of Italian wrapped around her, heavy and strange, but familiar enough from nights spent overhearing tourists in the lobby. She caught words here and there, broken pieces that carried weight she couldn't quite name. Her small fingers clenched the strap of her backpack as she leaned closer, her heart thumping faster. She didn't know yet what those words meant, not entirely. All she knew was that they didn't belong in the glittering safety of the Grand Orelia. And as Michael Carter straightened his tie and prepared to silence another boardroom with his certainty, Emily felt something shift in her chest. The invisible child had heard something she wasn't meant to hear, and it was about him. The Grand Orelia's corridors were not meant for children. Yet Emily's footsteps carried her deeper, each step quiet against the polished tiles. The golden lights of the lobby dimmed behind her, replaced by the muted glow of wall sconces that lit the narrow passage, where staff hurried like shadows, carrying trays of glasses and folded linens. To them, she was just another blur, a child waiting for her mother, invisible in a world that demanded speed and silence. But to Emily, this place was different. Here, the performance of wealth faded and reality whispered in corners. She pressed herself against the wall near a service door, clutching her backpack tightly. Just a few feet away, two men stood with their backs partially turned. They wore the same dark suits as the hotel security, the kind of uniforms that suggested authority, but their voices were low and sharp, carrying an edge of secrecy. Emily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. The rhythm of their words felt different from the English or French she sometimes overheard in the lobby. No, this was Italian. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Her mother often said she had ears like a fox. Emily picked up languages the way others picked up melodies. From months of sitting quietly in the lobby, she had pieced together fragments from overheard tourists and staff. Now those fragments became sharp blades cutting through the air. Carter, accident. Stasera, his name, an accident. Tonight, Emily's stomach tightened. She shifted her weight, and the strap of her backpack squeaked against the wall. One of the men paused, glancing over his shoulder, but she ducked her head quickly, pretending to fiddle with her shoelaces. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. After a long second, the man turned back, muttering something about time and opportunity. Her small hands trembled as she hugged her knees to her chest. Michael Carter. She knew his name, had heard it whispered in admiration and envy in the lobby. Some called him ruthless. Others called him a genius. She only knew him as a man people stepped aside for, the kind of man whose life had no connection to hers. Yet now she held something fragile, like a matchstick in a storm, knowledge no one else had. Emily's first instinct was to run to her mother, but her mother was working, and more than once. She had been scolded for wandering. She thought about telling a bellhop or one of the receptionists, but the image of them brushing her off rose in her mind. She was just a little girl in wrinkled clothes. Who would believe her? Meanwhile, in the grand conference hall, Michael Carter adjusted the cuff of his suit as though preparing for battle. His lawyers handed him final drafts of the contracts, their voices calm, their eyes sharp. He scanned the lines with a precision born from years of treating business as war. To him, today was another conquest, another step toward global dominance. He felt no danger, no threat. The walls around him were marble and glass. His empire, fortified by billions, but fate was already moving against him. Emily peered once more around the corner, her wide eyes watching as the two men moved down the hall, their words fading but their meaning echoing in her head. They had mentioned a drink, a toast, something about non-failure, not failing. She couldn't understand the full plan, but the way they smiled chilled her. This wasn't a casual conversation. It was a conspiracy. As she pressed her hand against her chest, willing her racing heart to slow. The adults swept past her, oblivious, and Michael Carter's world ticked forward toward the meeting as if everything were normal. Yet the little girl, hidden in the service corridor, knew better. She didn't have the words, not yet, to explain the danger in a way that would make them listen. But she had something else, determination. Emily had been ignored all her life, overlooked by everyone except her mother. But now she held a secret powerful enough to shatter the untouchable world of the Millionaire CEO. And as Michael Carter lifted a glass of water to his lips in the conference hall, the girl no one noticed began to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Emily's legs felt heavy as she slipped back toward the edges of the lobby. The echoes of the men's words in Italian clung to her like shadows she couldn't shake off. Her mind kept replaying those fragments. Carter, accident, tonight. She hugged her backpack tighter, the frayed fabric pressing into her chin, as if it could protect her from the weight of what she now knew. She wanted to run straight to someone, to shout what she had heard, but her small voice had been ignored too many times before. She was only 7. She was invisible here, but invisibility had its cost. Emily's breath caught when she spotted one of the men again, this time walking down the grand lobby as though he belonged there, blending in perfectly with the other suited staff. His gaze swept the crowd with practiced calm. When his eyes brushed past her bench, she froze so completely it was as though her very heartbeat had stopped. Only when he turned away did she dare to exhale. A chill ran through her. If she could see them so easily, then they could just as easily see her. Her mind raced. She needed to find someone important. Not her mother. Her mother would scold her for eavesdropping. Not the other staff. They were too busy, too dismissive. That left only one option, the man whose name had been whispered in that dark corridor. The man they were planning to hurt. Emily's wide eyes darted across the lobby until they landed on him. Michael Carter. He moved like a storm wrapped in silk, his presence bending the flow of the room without a word. Assistants trailed him with tablets and folders, lawyers leaned into whispered details, and hotel managers nearly bowed as they guided him toward the conference hall. He didn't walk, he commanded. To a child like Emily, he seemed impossibly tall, impossibly unreachable, like one of the marble statues that lined the garden courtyard outside. Yet he was the man they had spoken of, and he was in danger. Her feet carried her forward before her courage could catch up. She slipped between clusters of guests, her denim jacket brushing against the pressed suits of men who didn't notice her. Her heart thudded so loudly she feared it would betray her. As Michael stopped near the grand doors of the conference hall, Emily darted closer. She tugged on the sleeve of the nearest aide, a woman with sharp glasses and an expression that said she had no patience for interruptions. "I need to talk to him," Emily whispered urgently, pointing toward Michael. The woman barely looked at her. "Run along, sweetheart. This is a private meeting." Emily shook her head, her voice trembling but fierce. "It's important. They're going to hurt him." The aide frowned, annoyed now, and waved her off. "Security will remove you if you don't leave." She turned her back, already forgetting Emily existed. Panic clawed at Emily's chest. She couldn't let them ignore her. With a burst of desperation, she darted forward, her small hands reaching out until they brushed against the tailored sleeve of Michael Carter himself. For a moment, she thought she might faint from the audacity of it. His head turned, those piercing blue eyes dropping to meet hers. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm, sharp and low, the kind of voice that could freeze a room. Emily's lips parted, but the words tangled on her tongue. She could feel the stares of his entourage burning into her. One man stepped forward, ready to pull her back, but Michael lifted a hand to stop him. He studied her the way one might study a puzzle piece that didn't belong. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. You can't drink anything." They said your name. In Italian, they said, "Accident." Tonight, the room seemed to still around her, though maybe it was only in her own mind. Michael Carter's expression didn't shift. His face remained carved in ice. He lowered his gaze for a moment, as if dismissing her entirely, then turned back to his aide. "Handle this," he said coldly, already stepping toward the doors. Emily's heart sank. She had done the bravest thing she'd ever attempted, and still, she was brushed aside like dust on a marble floor. Yet as the men in suits ushered him into the hall, she caught the briefest flicker in his eyes, a shadow of something he hadn't shown the others, suspicion, unease. And behind her, in the reflection of the chandelier, Emily caught sight of one of the Italian guards standing at the far end of the lobby, his gaze fixed directly on her. She froze. The message in his eyes was clear. She had been noticed. The little girl, who had lived invisible all her life, had just stepped into a game, far larger than herself, and now she could no longer hide. The doors of the conference hall shut behind Michael Carter with a muted thud, sealing him into a chamber designed for power. The long mahogany table stretched like a battlefield between him and the European investor seated across from him. Crystal glasses of water gleamed in front of each chair. Silver trays bore carefully prepared hors d'oeuvres, and pens lay beside thick leather-bound folders embossed with golden lettering. Everything had been planned to perfection. Everything except the faint echo of a child's voice still lingering in his ears. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate calm, ignoring the ghost of unease that trailed him. Accident. Tonight. That was what she'd said. In Italian? How could a child even know enough to put those words together? He dismissed it, at least outwardly. He could not afford distraction. Not here. Not now. The men across the table carried billions in their briefcases, and their patience was measured in minutes. As the meeting began, his lawyers projected the final terms onto a sleek screen, each clause crisp, rehearsed, familiar. Michael's voice was steady, each word precise as he explained the vision. Towers rising in London, Frankfurt, Rome, progress, power, profit, the same trinity he had worshipped his entire life. The investors nodded, some skeptical, some impressed, but Michael was unshaken. His empire was secure, and yet, when a server in a white jacket glided into the room to pour sparkling water into his glass, his eyes lingered longer than usual on the liquid's faint shimmer. The girl's warning pressed against the back of his mind. He hesitated so subtle only he noticed and then continued speaking, letting the untouched glass sit by his right hand. Asterisk outside the hall. Emily pressed herself against the cool stone wall, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She had been shooed away by staff, threatened with being removed from the hotel if she caused more disruptions. But she refused to leave. Her mother would be furious if she were caught. But something in her small chest told her she couldn't go. Not yet. Not when those men were still here. Not when she could see their shadows slipping through the lobby, moving too calmly for men with nothing to hide. She crouched by a service cart, pretending to tie her shoelaces as the security men strode past. Their conversation clipped and hushed. She caught another sliver of Italian, sicuro, bicchiere, stasera, safe, glass, tonight. Her heart thudded so loudly she pressed a hand against it, afraid the sound alone would give her away. They weren't just planning something vague, they were planning something precise. The glass stopped back in the hall. Michael leaned forward, his hands braced against the table as he laid out the final expansion proposal. One of the investors, a man with silver hair and the faintest accent, interrupted him. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "we admire your confidence. But surely there are risks. Your empire grows fast. Too fast." Michael's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," he replied, his tone like steel wrapped in velvet, "the only risk is hesitation." Asterisk, the investors chuckled softly, impressed by his composure. But beneath the table, his fingers brushed the untouched glass of water again. He couldn't shake the thought of that child, her pale face and trembling voice. For the first time in years, doubt flickered at the edges of his carefully constructed certainty. Emily peeked around the corner, her wide blue eyes scanning for him. She couldn't see inside the meeting room, but she could feel the tension pulling tighter, like invisible strings stretched afar. She scribbled frantic notes in the margins of her sketchbook. "Guards Italian glass guard danger." Her handwriting was messy, letters tilted and uneven, but her determination was steady. If they wouldn't believe her words, maybe they'd believe the evidence she collected. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Emily gasped, spinning around, only to see one of the guards looming over her, his dark eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here, ragazza?" He hissed under his breath, the Italian word for girl sharp on his tongue. She froze, clutching her sketchbook against her chest like a shield. Her mind screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The guard's grip tightened. Then, from across the hall, a maid pushing a trolley turned the corner. The guard released Emily instantly, his expression smoothing into something neutral. "Stay out of places you don't belong," he muttered before striding away. Emily's knees trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she flipped open her sketchbook and underlined her notes until the paper nearly tore. No one would protect her if she stayed silent. She had to find another way to reach Michael Carter. Inside, the meeting drew to a close. Contracts were signed, promises made. As the investors rose to shake hands, Michael finally lifted the glass of water. For a moment, it hovered in his hand, the light glinting off the rim. The girl's words surged back. "They said your name. They said accident. Tonight." His jaw tightened. Slowly, deliberately, he set the glass back down, untouched. His aides barely noticed, too busy congratulating him. But in that small act of restraint, a crack appeared in the fortress of Michael Carter's certainty. For the first time, he wasn't sure if control could protect him, and outside the conference hall, Emily leaned against the wall, her small face pale, but her eyes fierce. She knew the night was far from over. The game had only just begun, and she was no longer invisible. The applause inside the conference hall echoed like muted thunder, polite and practiced. The European investors clasped Michael Carter's hand one by one, their smiles gleaming, their pens sealing deals worth billions. To anyone else, the moment was a triumph, another conquest in Michael's relentless march across the global chessboard. But to him, something felt wrong. The applause sounded hollow. The air felt too heavy. The child's trembling words still coiled around his mind like smoke he couldn't clear away. He adjusted his cufflinks, forcing a thin smile for the cameras, but as the last investor released his hand, a strange sensation rippled through his chest. At first, it was subtle, a quick tightening, a flutter like a skipped heartbeat. He ignored it, moving toward the exit with his entourage. But then it hit again, sharper this time, radiating into his arm, climbing toward his throat. He slowed his pace, his perfect posture wavering. His assistants glanced at him, but said nothing. Michael Carter did not falter. Not here. Not ever. Yet within moments, the tightening became unbearable. His vision blurred at the edges, lights from the chandelier above him smearing into streaks of gold. He stumbled, one polished shoe sliding against the marble floor. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The unshakable CEO, the man carved of ice and iron, was swaying like a tree about to break in a storm. His lawyers rushed to his side, panic breaking through their polished exteriors. "Sir, Mr. Carter," their voice is cracked. The aides gestured for medical staff, but Michael could barely hear them. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hand clutching at his chest. His mind, so disciplined, so ordered, reeled with a single realization. The girl had been right. Emily had not left. She stood just outside the conference doors, her small frame pressed against the wall, sketchbook clutched to her chest. When she saw the commotion inside, her heart leapt to her throat. She pushed past a maid, through the gap in the doors, ignoring the shouts to stay back. Her sneakers squeaked as she ran into the hall, her voice breaking the stunned silence. "It's them. The guards," she cried, pointing with her trembling hand. "I heard them. They want to kill him." All eyes turned first toward her, then toward Michael. The investors recoiled in shock, whispers spreading like wildfire. The aides tried to pull her back, muttering about nonsense. But Emily's desperation gave her strength that even adults couldn't contain. She twisted free, running to Michael's side, where he had collapsed into a chair, his face pale, his lips pressed thin against the pain. "Don't drink anything," she pleaded, her voice raw. "They put something in the glass. I heard them, please believe me." For the first time in his life, Michael Carter looked at a child not as an afterthought, not as background, but as the only person in the room speaking truth. Her wide, terrified eyes held no agenda, no contracts, no lies, only the frantic courage of someone who had been ignored too long. And in that moment, his armor cracked, security swept the hall, and chaos erupted. The two Italian guards, once so calm, suddenly stiffened under the stares of dozens. When confronted, they tried to slip away through the side doors. But Emily shouted again, her small voice cutting sharper than the lawyer's demands. "It's them. Don't let them leave." The investors, rattled and fearful for their own lives, moved aside. Real hotel security surged forward, intercepting the men. In the struggle that followed, a vial slipped from one guard's pocket, shattering on the marble floor. A pungent chemical scent filled the air. Gasps spread. The evidence was undeniable. Michael, still clutching his chest, felt a surge of cold dread. This was no coincidence, no child's fantasy. His empire had nearly been undone in silence, and it had been a 7-year-old girl, an invisible child no one believed, who had pulled him back from the brink. Emily stood beside him, trembling but unyielding, as the guards were dragged away. Her small hand hovered uncertainly near his, as though she wanted to reach out, but didn't dare. He met her gaze, his breath ragged, and for the first time, the ruthless CEO whispered words no one expected from his lips. "You saved me." The room held its breath. Billionaires, lawyers, and politicians, all of them frozen as they watched the most powerful man they knew bow, however slightly, to the truth spoken by a child. But beneath the shock of the moment, deeper shadows stirred, for the guards had not acted alone. Someone had sent them. Someone close enough to know Michael Carter's schedule, his habits, his vulnerabilities. The real enemy was still out there, hidden behind a mask of loyalty. And as Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of Emily's courage pressing against his fractured certainty, one thought pulsed in his mind. The little girl no one noticed had not only saved his life, she had opened the door to betrayal that would shake his empire to its core. The air in the conference hall was thick with tension, the kind that lingered long after the chaos had passed. The guards had been dragged away in handcuffs, the shattered vials swept into evidence bags. But the silence that followed was more unsettling than the commotion had been. Michael Carter sat in his chair, his chest still rising and falling unevenly, his face pale against the harsh glow of the chandeliers. Around him, his aides whispered frantically into phones, investors demanded explanations, and hotel staff scrambled to restore order. Yet in the center of the storm, his gaze remained fixed on the small figure standing only a few feet away. Emily clutched her sketchbook to her chest, her wide eyes darting nervously around the room. She had spoken, been heard, and most terrifying of all, been proven right. Every instinct told her she should shrink back into invisibility, but she couldn't move. Not when she knew this was far from over. The guards were only pieces on the board. Someone else had moved them. Michael lifted a trembling hand, gesturing for silence. His voice, though weakened, carried its old steel. This wasn't random. His eyes swept the room, scanning faces that had once seemed unshakable. Someone orchestrated this. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. His aides stiffened, their loyalty suddenly under scrutiny. For the first time in his career, Michael felt the ground beneath him shift. He had built his empire on certainty, on control, on the belief that betrayal could be anticipated and crushed. Yet tonight, betrayal had walked into his meeting wearing his own company's uniform. The police arrived, their radios crackling, their questions sharp. Emily was pulled aside gently by a young officer who crouched to meet her gaze. "You heard them, sweetheart. Can you tell us what they said?" She nodded quickly, her voice shaking but clear. "They said his name. They said accident. Tonight. And something about a glass." She pointed toward the table, where the untouched water still gleamed under the lights. They smiled when they said it. The officer's expression hardened. He scribbled notes, but Michael was no longer listening. His eyes had narrowed, his mind racing through the possibilities. Only a handful of people had access to his schedule. Only those closest to him knew he would be here, in this hotel, at this time, which meant the betrayal was not from an outsider. It was inside his circle, as paramedics checked his pulse and urged him to rest. Michael's eyes flicked toward his lead aide, a man who had served him faithfully for nearly a decade. The aide's face was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Michael noticed, though he said nothing. Not yet. Emily, still standing nearby, saw it too. Her gift had always been noticing things others missed, the quiver in a voice, the hesitation in a step, the weight of silence. And in that moment, she realized something that made her shiver. The danger wasn't gone. It was sitting in the room with them. The investors began to leave, their faces pale, their faith in Michael Carter's invincibility shaken. His empire would survive tonight, but its foundation had cracked. Michael leaned forward, his voice low, meant only for Emily. "Why did you help me?" Her small shoulders lifted in a shrug, though her eyes held a seriousness beyond her years. Because no one else would listen. The word struck him harder than any betrayal. For all his power, for all his billions, he had been blind, and the only reason he was alive was because a little girl, who was supposed to be invisible, had chosen to speak. As the police led the captured guards out, one of them turned his head, a sly smile twisting across his face. He said something in Italian quick, mocking before being shoved forward. Emily caught a single word, "Padrone, master." Her stomach sank. They weren't just foot soldiers. They belonged to someone higher, someone who had given the order, someone powerful. Michael's chest tightened again, though not from poison this time, from realization. The attempt on his life wasn't an isolated act. It was part of something larger. The betrayal wasn't just close. It was at the very heart of his empire. And as he rose unsteadily to his feet, supported by trembling aides, he knew his life had changed forever. The ruthless CEO, who once thought himself untouchable, had been saved by the smallest, quietest voice in the room. And now, he would have to confront a truth far more dangerous than assassination. The enemy was someone he trusted. Emily's single quotes as hand brushed against his sleeve, hesitant but steady. Her presence grounded him, reminding him that survival wasn't just about control. It was about courage. And in that moment, Michael Carter realized he no longer stood at the top of his empire alone. The game of betrayal had only just begun, and his unlikely ally was a 7-year-old girl who had already proven braver than anyone in his circle of power. The night deepened around the Grand Orelia, the glow of its chandeliers casting long shadows over a building that had once felt like a fortress of wealth. Now it seemed fragile, like glass that could shatter with the faintest crack. Michael Carter sat alone in the private suite that hotel staff had hastily secured for him. The contracts of the day stacked untouched on the table. His aides had scattered like frightened birds, each offering excuses, reassurances, and empty promises before retreating. Only the people had stayed. Emily, curled up in a chair with her worn backpack, and Detective Alvarez, a seasoned officer with tired eyes who was now leading the investigation. The guards had confessed nothing. Not yet. But the evidence, the vial, the overheard words, the timing spoke clearly. It was no accident. The attempt on Michael's life had been orchestrated, and the question remained, who stood behind it? Alvarez's pen scratched against his notebook as he asked questions, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Michael. Mr. Carter, you need to understand, these men didn't act alone. They were precise, patient, and well-funded. Whoever ordered this knew you better than most. Michael's jaw tightened, his reflection in the window staring back at him, a man who had built towers out of steel and glass, but failed to see the cracks within his own circle. His mind raced through names, board members, partners, rivals, friends. The thought cut deeper than the chest pains earlier. One of them wanted him dead. Emily shifted in her chair, her little legs dangling as she hugged her sketchbook. She had been silent for a long while, but her eyes were wide open, observing the adults with a sharpness they didn't notice. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but steady. I saw him. Both men turned toward her, Michael's brows furrowed. Who? Emily hesitated, chewing her lip, then pointed toward the hallway beyond the suite. Your man, the one with the glasses. He was watching me when I heard them talking. He looked scared when they took the guards away. Not scared for you, scared for himself. Michael's stomach dropped. His lead aide, the man who had stood by him for nearly 10 years, who carried his schedules, knew his habits, anticipated his moves. If betrayal had a face, it was his most trusted hand. Detective Alvarez nodded grimly. Well, bring him in. He signaled to an officer outside, and within minutes, the aide was escorted into the room, his face pale, his composure cracking under the weight of suspicion. Why? Michael's voice was low, dangerous, colder than any boardroom negotiation. Why would you try to kill me? The aide's lips trembled. At first, silence. Then a bitter laugh escaped him. Because you made us pawns in your empire. You built towers while we rotted underneath. Do you know how many lives you've crushed chasing your profits? You thought yourself untouchable. I wanted you to feel small just once, and I wasn't alone. The room fell into a silence so sharp it cut. Michael stared at the man who had once been his shadow, realizing the betrayal wasn't about money. It was about revenge, about resentment that had festered right under his nose. Emily's eyes shimmered with fear, but she didn't look away. She clutched her sketchbook tighter, her small voice piercing the heavy air. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. You almost took him away, and you don't even care. The aide's face twisted, but before he could speak again, Alvarez stepped forward, placing him in cuffs. That's enough. As the man was led away, Michael sank into his chair, his chest heaving. The empire he thought he controlled had nearly consumed him, and the only reason he was alive was because of the little girl who had dared to speak when no one else would. He looked at Emily, really looked at her this time, not as background, not as a nuisance, but as the one person in the entire building who had seen clearly. She met his gaze with the quiet defiance of someone who had been invisible too long. You saved my life, he said softly, the words firing on his tongue. But more than that, you showed me the truth. I've been blind. Emily tilted her head, unsure how to respond. You just needed to listen. Michael's throat tightened. For decades, he had silenced voices, dismissed warnings, lived only by power. Tonight, a 7-year-old child had shattered that world with nothing but courage. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pen, his symbol of control, the tool that had built his empire, and placed it on the table in front of her. This doesn't belong to me anymore, he said. Not like it did. Maybe it never did. Emily blinked, her small hand brushing the pen hesitantly. She didn't fully understand, but she knew it mattered. Detective Alvarez cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we'll need you tomorrow for further statements. But for tonight, you should rest. As the detective left, Michael stood slowly and walked toward the window. The city stretched beyond, towers of glass rising into the night sky, monuments to his ambition. For the first time, he saw them differently, not as trophies, but as fragile things that could crumble if built on betrayal. Behind him, Emily curled into her chair, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. She had saved a life, toppled a lie, and carried the weight of truth in a world that never listened to her. Michael turned, watching her drift into sleep. I felt something stir in his chest, not the pain of poison, but something new, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Gratitude. The ruthless millionaire CEO had been changed forever, not by contracts, not by billions, but by a little girl who refused to stay silent. And in the quiet of that hotel suite, as the night closed in, Michael Carter understood the final shocking truth. For all his power, his life had never truly been his own to control. It had always been fragile, and tonight, it had been saved by the one person the world never thought mattered. The invisible child had become his unlikely savior, and nothing would ever be the same again.